Welcome back to Missing. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. The guest that we have on is one of those guests that I enjoy so much. I know you enjoy it because we're not talking about a specific missing person. It's one of these episodes and one of these conversations where we go deeper into the reasons why people might go missing. And being in a abusive, narcissistic, emotionally abusive, or physically abusive, and both, that is a huge factor as to why a lot of the people we talk about are never found, turned up deceased, or any other circumstance that brings the family members to us to figure out what's going on. But Tim, before we figure that out, I want to figure out your mood. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for asking. And yeah, you're right about all that. And this interview that we have with author Vanessa Reiser really goes into narcissism and narcissistic abuse. In fact, her new book is called Narcissistic Abuse, A Therapist's Guide to Identifying, Escaping, and Healing from Toxic and Manipulative People. And it is fantastic. I think our listeners are really going to enjoy this conversation because there are so many helpful tips and facts in this conversation.
I also found it extremely interesting during our conversation, which is heavily focused on narcissism. We talked about how that word itself is almost being diminished in social media and TikTok and Instagram, where people are being accused of being a narcissist because they're putting their likeness out there for other people to consume and comment on. And we recently had a conversation with writer J.W. Oker in a Crawlspace episode where he talked about cults and cult following and narcissism, and he brought up the same thing. He literally said, I don't know what the word narcissist means anymore because it's spoiled by TikTok. And I think that's hugely important in this conversation, where there's a big difference between what's happening on social media, posting pictures and being an influencer, and being in an incredibly abusive, narcissistic relationship, which Vanessa was. And her book goes through this. And I think the more information people have, obviously, the better. But when it comes from somebody with her experience, it's even more profound.
Yeah, absolutely. She is a therapist herself, and you can check out her website at teletherapist.net. But yeah, if you've ever been curious about how to identify, warning signs of narcissism or narcissistic abuse, or you ever needed to create an exit strategy to safely escape from an abuser, and this goes for anyone listening or any of their friends or family. I mean, it's just sadly so common, but this book goes through all these things, and I think it's a very helpful book for a lot of people.
And we're also going to put the phone number and the link for the domestic violence hotline, the National Domestic Violence Hotline. That will be put in the show notes. Again, just like you said, if you're a family member, a friend, or if you yourself think this is happening, you need to take the steps to get yourself out of it, and we truly hope that you do. Tim, we should probably invite the listeners to continue to the end of the episode where we have some final thoughts on all of this.
Absolutely. We're going to connect again at the end of this interview. So thank you very much for listening. We really appreciate it. Please follow us on social media at Missing CSM, and make sure to check out Vanessa's book and follow her on social media. There are links in the show notes. We're going to break quick for commercial here, and we'll be right back with Vanessa. Welcome to the podcast, Vanessa Reiser. How are you today?
Great. How are you guys?
We're doing great. It's so good to see you, and thank you so much for coming on the show. The topics that you are going to bring to the table are some of the most important topics that we like to bring out to our listeners, because a lot of our listeners want to know how to identify these markers of certain characteristics and behaviors just to make sure that they're safe, their family members are safe, friends. But before we get into that, can you introduce yourself? I'm laughing because you have multiple appointments going on and you weren't sure which show you were coming on. So we're actually getting introduced right now in real time as well. Can you introduce yourself to the listeners and to us?
Sure. I am Vanessa Reiser. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I specialize in narcissistic abuse and cult abuse. I am licensed in New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Florida. And I am best known for traversing New York State in a wedding dress to raise awareness for narcissistic abuse, 285 miles in 11 days. And I'm an author now. I just wrote a book, so really proud of it.
Very cool. Congrats on the new book. It's called Narcissistic Abuse, A Therapist's Guide to Identifying, Escaping, and Healing from Toxic and Manipulative People. Can you tell us about your decision to write the book?
Sure. I was in a relationship that was abusive. And when I got out of that relationship, I started my practice, and I specialize in this sort of niche work. And I started to hear the stories of so many victims, and what they were highlighting was sort of this playbook, a lot of the red flags that I'm sure we'll talk about today. And I began to compile all of this information, all of this insidiousness, and all of the long stories that I was trying to make more succinct, and sort of fuse that with the concept of cult abuse, because the idea of manipulation and mind control was the overarching theme. And when that clicked for me, this light bulb went on over my head, and I thought, this is serious. Like, this is very Pavlovian. This reinforcer is being used. It's like Psych 101. And that's what cult leaders use. So that's what the book aims to do, is really highlight the mind control.
Also, congratulations on that run, the 285 miles. What sparked that idea, and when were you thinking to yourself, because I'm sure it wasn't the first time you've laced up running shoes and you were like, I'm going to go do this. So what was the moment when you said to yourself, okay, we're doing this 285 miles, I'm not messing around?
Yeah. I was on a run during COVID, and typical Vanessa fashion was like running rogue. Like the state park was closed, and I was like, that I'm running. And I ran, and I was kind of doing a lot of that because there was not much else to do. I was working, and it came to me on a run. I called my dear friend, Bob Riley, who is also a psychotherapist. And I asked him, because he's an Ultraman, which is a very large Ironman triathlon. I asked him, do you think I could run the state of New York in a wedding dress to kind of raise awareness and get some attention? He goes, yeah, you can do that. And then I thought, oh God, now I have to do this. So we got the logistics together. We got the route together. We got kind of a team together, and managed to put together what was a really, really incredible journey, not just for my own healing, but people were sort of like, yes, go Vanessa, because a lot of my clients are kind of suffering in silence in terms of the judicial system and the family courts and stuff like this. So a lot of people were kind of rooting for me, myself included. And then we ultimately did traverse New Jersey, Connecticut, and Massachusetts in the wedding dress to continue to raise awareness.
Well, I'm putting it out there right now. If you want to do it again and you want to pick another state, I will also put on a wedding dress and I will run with you if that's going to help raise the awareness for your cause.
Thank you. That's awesome.
Yeah, I've got one in the closet. I just haven't had an opportunity to use it.
That's great.
Can you tell me about the mechanics of that? How did you run without tripping?
So it was modified. I took it to a really famous cleaners in the city. They do a lot of work for Broadway, and they donated their efforts to the cause, which was to basically hack this wedding dress and make it run worthy. And then my girlfriend, Barry, who does a lot of work with dancers, was able to sort of make it so I could actually move. And that picture of the actual wedding dress was put in the New York Times, which I'm also really proud of. When I left that abusive relationship, there was a picture of me from the New York Marathon that got destroyed with the little tiny clipping from the New York Times when they put your name in there, and it got destroyed. And I was like really bummed out about this tiny little clipping. And so I guess karma gave me a gift, because they gave me a full kind of page in the New York Times, not a full page front, but like a little, a good amount of the page, I'll say. And so the dress itself did get hacked, and then we modified it.
You mentioned that you were in a emotionally abusive relationship, a narcissistic relationship. And we deal with a lot of topics, and a lot of our guests who come on are family members of mostly women who are not found, have not been found. They're missing. And it's like blatantly obvious who did it. There's been these indicators that have been happening for years, but a lot of the people will tell us how they weren't able to recognize certain things because of how subtle it is. Can you speak to the subtlety of narcissism and how that's used as sort of a mechanism to manipulate?
Yeah, it's extremely subtle. It's like death by 1,000 cuts. You have no idea what's happening to you until it's too late. These are people that are master manipulators. Poets, priests, and politicians oftentimes are able to kiss babies and put on this persona, superficial charm, and then behind the scenes, there's little ways that they could potentially be creating harm, like even something as subtle as pinching you, kind of poking you, keeping you from sleeping, restricting calories. While they seem like not that big of a deal, maybe they're coming from a position of love. Maybe you don't need to be eating that, this kind of stuff. So it is so insidious and so hard to process for yourself, let alone describe it to other people and then have other people believe it, because it's so impossible to imagine or fathom. But it is extremely insidious. These are people that are passive aggressive. They use the silent treatment. And while that may seem like, okay, big deal, like that's not abusive, it is emotionally abusive. And it sort of chips away at your autonomy. They isolate you. They keep you from looking at things that they want to protect themselves from, in terms of like the media. We saw this with Scientology, kind of keeping like blinders on you. You're not allowed to look at the press. And they gaslight. So they'll confuse you sometimes with not just verbal gaslighting. A good example of something that's rather insidious is they will actually gaslight you through hiding your belongings. You begin to feel that you're crazy. Where's my sweater? I put the sweater there. That is so strange. Am I losing it? And then you may ask your partner, did you move my sweater? No, I didn't move your sweater. Wow, that's so it's really this kind of chipping away. And it creates a brain injury, I think, of sorts. Like over time, the brain is like a fact-finding instrument. It's looking for patterns. And over time, it's like an injury. It really traumatizes you because you can't really express this to anyone. Somebody might say, oh, maybe you just misplaced your sweater. What do you, or you're walking in the kitchen and the sociopath that is your partner starts to hum the song that you were just listening on because they were gaslighting you through some cyber gaslighting. So they hacked into your Apple iCloud and they're listening to the song. You're like, how did you know I was just listening to that song? What are you talking about? They might say, and they may say it in front of other family members and then look at the family members like, is mom okay? I don't think she's well. Maybe we need to take her in to talk to a specialist so it's this kind of like horror movie version. Strangulation is another thing that we see is a huge precursor to homicide, where the cult leader or the narcissist or the sociopath, does something that they know won't leave a mark, or they think, you'll probably forgive because it's not a direct like kick to the throat. It's not a direct punch to the eye. So it is insidious. It comes in these ways that are just hard for you to even imagine, is really purposeful. So how are you going to describe this to people, and how the hell are they going to believe you? So it's the trifecta. How can I process it? How can I describe it? And who the hell is going to believe this shit? So that's really treacherous.
Right. But before you even get to those three factors, you have to come to terms with the fact that it's happening to you.
That's right. It's very hard to process. It's extremely hard to see gaslighting. It's extremely hard to see that level of manipulation. These are people that will cancel a flight and then be the hero that reschedules the flight. So they're the person who saves the day. This is a person who might, poke a hole in your tire so that they can pick you up off the side of the road because you have a flat tire. I mean, these are the things that they're doing. It's very forward thinking. And it is hard to imagine that, because how are you supposed to live your life imagining somebody's trying to thwart all of your good efforts? Most of the people who've gone through this, like myself, are very careful now who they surround themselves and would probably pick up on some things like that. But you're never going to be as good at it as they are. They've been doing it a long time. So it is hard, very hard to discern. We go through the characteristics and the red flags as much as we can, but it's hard. It's very hard.
Wow. And how common is that kind of behavior? What percentage of people exhibit that kind of behavior, if you know?
There's not a ton of data on this because narcissists are not really coming in to, be studied. They are not admitting, and they don't have insight or accountability. So we think that it's far more prevalent than has ever been thought before. Dr. Ramani puts out different numbers, and I have a few in my book, but they're so fluid and it's really hard to say. I would say there's 185 million victims of narcissistic abuse in the United States, I believe. So we know that it's coming out. These people are getting sort of disclosed more, but I think the idea that it's a buzzword is not something I'm wild about. I think it's just more prevalent than we realize.
I have so many questions that I don't want to just overload you, but is it possible that narcissists don't know that they're doing it?
Yes. I would say, though, the best way for me to describe this is the narcissist learns how to be a manipulator at a very young age. And that what happens is it becomes habit. So they lie so much that they have to keep up with the lie. They also confabulate. They fill in the blanks when they forget what reality is. And they are sometimes very, very, very deluded. So it almost can mimic schizophrenia in that these are people that believe the bullshit. So they believe the fantasy story of what they're living. Like when I was treating schizophrenics in the Bronx, they would come in and tell you the CIA is after me. And you would never say to somebody who had schizophrenia, like, no, the CIA is not after you. You just sort of, okay, tell me more. And they would probably get treated with medical management. Similarly, the narcissist can have sort of a rigidity. Like they believe oftentimes the shit that they're peddling. They have this grandiose sense of self. They actually subscribe to that belief. So I do believe there's a part of it that they do know what they're doing, that they sometimes forget because they're caught up in the lies, and then add in there the possibility of like high delusions.
Can you tell us a little bit about the cover of your book? It's got like peacock feathers. I'm just curious, what does that symbolize?
Sure. The peacock is kind of beautiful and flamboyant and also violent. So that's why we came up with the peacock, because it's sort of this gorgeous, majestic creature that is inviting and wonderful and is sometimes violent.
You said that there were these buzzwords out there and you're not too crazy about the buzzwords. And one of these buzzwords is gaslighting. And it reminded me of something that happened over the weekend. I was with people who are a little bit younger than me, and they said gaslighting. They said, that they just used it in a sentence. And I asked them if they knew the origin of gaslighting and what that means. And they told me what they thought it was, which was like, oh, you're just making someone think that there's something happening that there's not. But then I did the whole, like the actual gaslight, like lowering the gaslight and telling your wife that it's not lower. And they were like, are you serious? They had no idea. So what, in your opinion, I think that's a good example of just showing how like buzzwords will diminish the meaning. Are there any other buzzwords that you know out there or that you have a sort of an issue with on like it's starting to lose the meaning now?
Well, I think narcissism itself is overused in the way people think it's about selfies. If you're taking a selfie, that could be a narcissistic trait, sure. Thinking that you're grandiose or better than others, sure. Standing alone, though, that is not NPD. Having a pathological personality disorder means that your behaviors are pervasive. This is who you are. This is your baseline. You are always lying, cheating, manipulating, trying to control all the time. And so if you're sort of like, need a Snickers bar on any given Monday and you're acting like a jerk, that doesn't mean that you're a narcissist. All of us could be jerks for a variety of different reasons. But this is their pervasive personality. This is how they always are. They just can sometimes put on a show and behave as if they're not. But their sort of their baseline, their personality is to be that jerk that that you could be on occasion. So always trying to manipulate, always trying to control, always trying to be a lying, cheating, smearing scoundrel. So they are kind of constantly like this.
Interesting. And what role does empathy play in a person like this?
This is the whole thing. This is ground zero for the narcissist. The narcissist is indifferent to your pain. The sociopath enjoys your pain. So a good way for you to identify this might be the dead body was put there by the sociopath and the narcissist steps over the dead body. They are indifferent. The problem is there are often overlaps. So you can be a narcissist and a sociopath. And that's really important for people to understand. And there's different ways this shows up in terms of the more covert, like a Keith Raniere from the Nexium cult, who was rather unassuming and kind of you could never see him coming a mile away. And then you have the more overt version of this, who's sort of like the quintessential douchebag or somebody who, who's like pop collar, tons of cologne kind of schmuck. These are very different. And actually, I believe the covert version of this, like a Keith Raniere, is far more dangerous. That kind of unassuming, like Ted Bundy was kind of, famously just unassuming character, looked kind of like the guy next door. And so those are scarier versions of it. But I think the no empathy is the ground zero. This is where we really see the problems start, because without empathy, we cease to exist, right? So mother has the baby starts to cry, mother takes care of the baby, because what? Empathy kicks in, like, oh, I got to do something with this little baby. Like, don't cry, little baby. Without that, mother smokes a cigarette, marches on, baby dies, the whole thing is over. So this idea that like empathy isn't cool and like this like capitalistic, individualistic, environment that we're living in, that's really funny for a hot second. But like at the end of the day, we actually need to get back into like cultivating empathy, because that's the reason we're here. We need to sort of get, together on this on a macro scale before we have some serious problems.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors. And now we're back to the program.
This kind of goes in line with my next question, or a question that I wanted to ask, which is that this doesn't just exist in a romantic relationship. This exists in like business relationships and cultural relationships and political relationships. How does somebody in those positions who, let's say they are a narcissist, how do they use someone's empathy against them in a situation that's not a romantic relationship?
Yeah, I think the number is 1 out of 4 CEOs is a psychopath directly. So, and you can Google that one. I put that one in my book also, because they really don't care about climbing the corporate ladder. And they will absolutely triangulate the people around them. They don't care. And they can coerce others. And that's very cultish, very cult-like. We're seeing that with P. Diddy now and all of the players that he sort of had doing his dirty work. And as he became more and more powerful, it was almost impossible to go up against him, or you were murdered, basically, is what it's starting to look like for some people. And so they kind of just climb the corporate ladder, use people to do their dirty work, and they're very hard to go up against. And so that's a really good question, because it's not easy if your bread and butter is, hinged on this psychopath. What are you going to do? Just quit your job? And that's where we see the high level coercion and cult-like experiences.
And can you tell us about the stages of narcissistic abuse?
So I would say probably the original love bombing phase begins the dopamine experience. This is an amazing drug if you've ever had it. It's something else. So this is the long text messages. You are my soulmate. You're the best lover. You're the best friend. Here's some concert tickets, some diamonds, some, fancy things, bags and shoes, or something equivalent. And then the devaluing stage starts. And this might be as simple as the removal of the love bombing, that alone. And that's why it's so Pavlovian. It's like all of a sudden the silent treatment shows up. It doesn't have to be this overt cursing, you're a jerk kind of stuff. It just has to be the removal of the love bombing. And then you feel like, wait, did I do something wrong? So that would be like the second. And then you have the discard, which is basically just a fight. It could be on the first time until it's the final discard. And the cycle of abuse develops, right? So then you have the makeup session, the fallout. The makeup session, the tension building, and then the fallout. Makeup session, tension building, fallout. And that cycle of abuse develops into a trauma bond where you're really looking for that fix again. Make it okay again. I don't want to argue. And the fix is that dopamine. And it's very hard to break that trauma bond to get out of it. It takes people multiple efforts to try to extricate themselves from this environment, particularly if it's a cult. That's actually extremely dangerous. Why? Because you're outnumbered. The problem must be me. These hundreds of people are following blindly, or millions, as we can see, following blindly. And that's where it's even harder for people to get away from. But those are sort of that's the overarching way that it goes. That's the overarching theme, is the cycle of abuse.
And are people more susceptible to fall back into that pattern if they get out of a relationship or out of a situation, whether it's a cult or a romantic situation? Are they more susceptible to fall back into another one later on?
I would say if they don't do the work, yes, for sure.
Right, that makes sense.
And so many similarities between, I guess, a romantic narcissist and someone leading a cult. I guess, can you talk a little bit more about that connection?
Yeah, every cult is led by a narcissist, a sociopath, or a psychopath. So there's always this hierarchical experience where there's a leader and then there are minions, and they use the exact same tactics to manipulate everyone involved. You have sort of the flying monkeys or the followers. You have the main supply. You have supplemental supplies. These are the people that are feeding energy mostly to the narcissistic leader. And they're exactly the same. They are synonymous. When I figured that out in my own relationship, it was really incredibly enlightening for me. And so I'm really sort of desperate to get others to see that in some ways, unless we get out of those groupthink scenarios and start to teach children how to think independently, we all end up in those kinds of environments. It's not to not to victim blame others, but it's very hard not to. We sort of have this culture of, draw in between the lines and follow in line and pay attention and do what you're told. But we really need to cultivate in children ways to discern fact from fiction, to avoid themselves from getting gaslit, and also to think independently.
And I just want to clarify, you're just saying children, not just male children or female children or any gender child. You're saying children. And I think for whatever reason, and it sucks, but every time we have this conversation, my brain goes to the man's the narcissist and the woman is the one who is suffering at his hands. But are there any scenarios that you've seen where, there's been a reversal of that? Absolutely.
I have tons of the female children of narcissistic mothers. So I think it's highly underreported in domestic violence scenarios where the woman is the abuser. It's just, I think it's emasculating for men. And in some ways, this is something that I kind of understand, because I'm a little bit of a powerhouse. And I think when you're sort of like a strong person, it's harder to believe. You understand? Like if you're a masculine person, if you're a man, no one's going to believe you. And I felt a little bit of that, not to take away from what that feels like for men, but I felt like it was like, it can't be you, Vanessa. Like, you're a badass. There's no way. Like, and that's a real experience for men, is there's no way that it could be them. And that really, that hurts to think of that would be the case. But there are tons of victims of narcissistic women.
Yeah. And how do you have that dialogue with yourself?
You're talking about if you're the man in the relationship?
Yeah, or if you're a powerhouse woman.
I think the biggest thing that people need to really lock into is the truth. One of the things that helped me to identify in my experience that I wasn't the narcissist, because what happens is they mirror you so much in the beginning of the relationship and throughout. They kind of adopt your likenesses. They're somewhat chameleon-like. Oh, you like Spanish food? What a coincidence. So do I. Oh, you love reggae? Me too. I love reggae. And they start speaking your language. And so they mirror you and you become so codependent and enmeshed, almost like one. They isolate you. You have to spend so much time with them. It is so exhausting. And so when I got away from it, I had no idea. And what I really sunk my teeth into was the truth. I knew that I wasn't a liar. I was a lot of things, but I wasn't a liar. And they are pathological liars. They don't even need to be moving their lips to be lying. As I mentioned earlier, they're delusional. So they're always in this lying, future faking, crazy storyline universe. There's nothing real about the way that they think about themselves and others. And that was a way that I was able to free myself, as I just stood in the truth. I was thinking to myself, okay, this happened. I didn't text from that phone number. Like, I didn't do that. For a while, I was like, maybe I did that, because I was getting cyber gaslit. And I was wondering, like, did I actually text that? Did I do that? And a lot of people had to help me. I had a tribe of people that were like, no, you didn't do that. So I did have to lean into the truth. And I think that's really important. You have to stay sturdy in the truth.
That's going to be just another terrifying layer when you're trying to understand whether or not you're doing things. Like you mentioned the sweater being moved, but that's one thing. That's a physical thing that you could have just absentmindedly done. But with the cyber gaslighting, that's kind of another, again, terrifying layer, because it's not like absent-minded. You know what I mean? Like, it's not something that you would do in like a text message or something like that. That it feels more deliberate.
Yeah.
Is this like, can you go just a little deeper into the cyber gaslighting?
So this is where the narcissist might email themselves from your email address with threats. Or they may email themselves from your email address saying, I'm so sorry that I punched you in the face yesterday. I can't believe I did that. I don't know how to behave. I really need to talk to a doctor. I'm not well. Yesterday, I punched a little Jimmy in the face. I mean, they will literally just set you up into a scenario where you have to defend yourself from things that you never did in a court of law. And they will have receipts. And then when you confront them, because you're not knowing what's going on, and they're like, what are you talking about? And then you start to lose it. They will film you and your reaction to what they're doing to you. And then you go with the solid receipts again. And then you actually may go crazy. You may actually find yourself confused. I have clients that have been arrested, that have done jail time, that have been poisoned. So sometimes we're seeing whispers about that in the P. Diddy world as well, which is that they may poison you, put something in your drink, and then film you, walking with the baby and falling and saying, well, this person is drunk. Or so, yeah, the cyber stuff is really tricky. They could email your employer as you, quitting the job or cursing them out. The cyber stalking stuff is we're seeing sort of an upkick in that, as of late, obviously, because it's still new to us in terms of how they can hack, but they do that a lot.
Right. That is wild. And is the goal to make the person feel crazy, or the goal is to sort of get them in trouble in a legal sense, or both?
Both. But really, when you try to apply logic to the narcissist, it is a waste of energy. They literally are doing all of these things for sport. It's very cat and mouse. So they have a good time sucking your energy. I have clients that tell me the craziest stories about things that are really innocuous. Like a client went to court and her abuser puts a jar of pickles outside the door of the courthouse and with the attorney's name on it. And everyone's trying to figure out what is the point with the pickles. There's no point. This is an energy grab. It's just to make you get distracted and focus on some shit. And it's like, oh, look, it's working. I did it. I got control over there. They're thinking about, it's a power. It's like literally a drug. So yes, and And yes, they are always looking for like, it's not always logical. Sometimes it's just to make you question yourself, or for an energy grab, or to get you fired, to commit suicide. To commit suicide is the greatest gift for narcissists. Chef's kiss, because I had enough control over you. Look what I did. I have power.
And then what? And then they move on to the next person? Or I'm just assuming that some of these people aren't CEOs, so they don't have, the obligation or the responsibilities of being the CEO of a company. So what do they move on to the next person? They still maintain their regular job. I mean, I can't wrap my head around this. Like, that's their life. Like, that's insane.
Yes, it is. It is really hard to believe. It's hard to wrap your mind around. And that's why so many of my clients come to me and they struggle, because it's hard for anyone to process that, let alone the judicial system that's designed to protect people from these abusers. But it is insane. And it's really hard to manage that.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. So you got to recognize it before you can get away from it. But is that the only way to combat this? Basically getting away?
Absolutely. There's no other. It's a relationship of inevitable harm. Just like every cult, every real cult ends in death, even if it's sort of the death of your soul. It's this idea of, if you give the narcissist what they want, they will turn up the dial. And if you don't give them what they want, they will turn up the dial. You're screwed either way. You can't just placate them, because then when you do, they're like, ooh, that worked. Let's try this. And if you don't give them what they want, then it's for sport. Let's go. Let's play. It's really dangerous. They're dangerous people.
And if you're a family member, is there something, or a friend who sees all of this happening, is there something that you typically recommend or tell somebody to do or say to the other person? And as the other person, should you be looking out for a family member or friend telling you something that you're just not hearing or seeing because you're too deep in?
That is a phenomenal question. We do this with people that we may be trying to extricate from a cult. And just like with the NXIVM cult and the Keith Raniere experience, India Oxenberg's mother was really, really trying to get her out of the cult, famous actress. And she was desperate to get her daughter out of the cult. And it wasn't really working. And the more that they said, you're in a cult, you got to get out of there, the more she would dig in. And so what we try to do is use the 5 senses, which is sort of like dialectical behavioral therapy, to get people to sort of identify with the person they were prior. So this idea of getting connected to who you were before. Now, this really only works in cultic experiences where you had an identity before. So if you were raised with a narcissistic parent, it's not going to work as well. But this would be like the 5 senses. So maybe cooking a meal for that person, is something that is indicative of prior, right? So something that maybe mother makes and it smells like your childhood. Imagery, so pictures of who you were prior. Touch, maybe an animal. It's supposed to elicit this response of like who this person was before. Music is a good one. Some music that you can play that kind of gets them to remember who they were prior. And it's really hard. I know it sounds crazy and hard, and that's because it is. But that seems to be the only way to get people out of this, to snap out of it, is to sort of identify with the person they were prior to this experience.
Wow. And what if you are a kid with a narcissistic parent? How do you, traverse that?
Yeah, that's sometimes there's a loss there, quite honestly, because they are getting so groomed, and they are so mind controlled, and there are often sort of genetic components. And so that can be really, really tricky. And then I would often coach the people involved, that it might be a loss. The reason why India Oxenberg was able to get out of it. And I think she's having a baby soon too, which is very exciting. So she's managed to really move on, is because she wasn't raised in a narcissistic family. Her mother was able to get her to snap out of it. But if you are raised in that environment and your abuser or your cult leader is your parent, it's very hard.
Is there like a section of time or a generation that's had more of this than previous generations? Or is it more prevalent, like, say, today, just because we're able to communicate better with simply having a communication device on our person at all times?
I don't think so. I think this is an age-old issue. I think the good news is that we're actually developing language that describes what it is. And I think ultimately the possibility exists that we can protect people from it now, because we are doing that. I think of like the Salem witches were probably trying to describe something narcissistic, and they were like, hang those bitches in the middle. Like, I don't know. I think that it's good that we're talking about it. We are seeing a lot of narcissistic traits with social media. We are seeing a lot of capitalistic kind of experiences and individualistic things in terms of corporate, greedy corporate gangsters, which is kind of troubling. And so we're kind of coveting all of these fancy, shiny things, which is also kind of scary. So to answer your question, I think it's an age-old thing, but I don't know that we're necessarily trending specifically towards fixing it, other than we are talking about it more.
You mentioned the Salem witch trials, and that just made me think about a lot of things that are done to other groups and communities that are just done out of fear of like the unknown or fear of losing something that they once possessed. Like, do narcissists have that fear as well, that they need to like evoke these emotions or manipulate because they're afraid of something?
They are. Narcissists do experience a ton of anxiety. Psychopaths don't. Psychopaths are sort of like, oh, okay, who cares? But narcissists tend to be sucking on cigarettes, pulling their hair out. They're very anxious people. So that is something that I usually will assess for. As a matter of fact, some of my clients come to me and they'll say, I always thought my abuser had like Asperger's or something. It's like almost like this muted affect, like nothing. And then I always go, ooh, that could be something scary. This idea that they are really not anxious creatures. They're sort of, it doesn't matter to them. So narcissists specifically do experience a lot of anxiety.
Really interesting. And can you tell us a little bit about COVID and I guess what that could have done to this topic? And are we still dealing with effects from the pandemic?
I think so. In terms of the domestic violence cases, there was an extreme upkick in calls to domestic violence centers. So people were having to hold down the fort in this, household with an abuser. And so we saw the divorce rates just go skyrocket. Lawyers made a ton of money after COVID and are probably still trying to kind of clean that mess up. But I think when you're in a house with an abuser who can't peacock around and, parade themselves on social media or go to the concerts or find the hookers and all of that, I think they were really, really targeting their main supplies in a way that was really treacherous for a lot of families.
But do you think, are we coming out of that, or is that sort of like a phase, to lack of a better word?
I think it probably developed into the conversation we're having now. I think it showed what this was. People started to talk about it, and they started to get tired of it. And there seems to be a fracturing of relationships that hopefully we can remedy. But I think people are really distrusting. They're also probably broke because it's an expensive endeavor. So it's going to take a while, I think, to probably clean that up, and not just financially, but like in our souls.
Well, yeah. And you also mentioned something that I thought was a really interesting observation when you said that this causes a brain injury, which I think is really interesting because we've never heard that before, that over the course of time, this does eventually injure your brain. How do you repair that then? How do you bring that part of your brain back to where it was?
So in order for you to do things like that. The good news is that we have neuroplasticity. If you have a neurotypical brain, you can actually fix trauma. So it goes into a lot of DBT. So as I mentioned, a lot of the five senses in terms of getting grounded and finding yourself back at baseline. So if you get triggered and you have like a fight or flight response, you have to kind of identify the triggers and then find a way to soothe yourself. Lots of radical self-love. So this is something simple like lighting a candle, taking a bath, snuggling a dog, connecting with people that are healthy and safe. But really, if you are devalued in a relationship with a narcissist, a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy will also help. So this is going to look like inputting logical counter responses to the garbage that's maybe floating around in there. If you have unhealthy inner dialogue, you want to kind of capture what that is, catch it, identify what made it get there, catch what it is, and then go up against it. So, if I have this girl in my head who tells me that I'm fat all day, I have to develop a counter logical response to that is something that I believe. It can't just be like, oh, I'm skinny. It has to be like, okay, I'm strong. So if any of that inner dialogue, it takes a lot of work to catch it, and then you have to kind of reprogram it. And over time, you will begin to realize that all of that was garbage. We get this sometimes from our parents. We get it from society. For women, it is generally anesthetic, like we feel certain how we look. For men, it's definitely about like success. Generally, that's how some of them will feel. But it can be done, and you have to kind of put up visuals in your home, self-love visuals, things that you that will remind you of who you are. Maybe it's a picture of yourself that you feel rather empowered by. It could be a degree, it could be a trophy or something like this. So we kind of get radical self-love isn't just about like a heated blanket. It's about like really like loving yourself, celebrating yourself, almost like if you're the narcissist, quite honestly, which feels really weird to people because, it can feel like you're so codependent and you've been trained to be so giving. So you have to celebrate yourself, and it's okay to do that.
That's funny you said it's almost like you're the narcissist, but when you were saying that, I was picturing this imagery in my head of the way like a team of firefighters will burn out an area of the forest just to stop the fire that's bigger. And that's what I was picturing when you were going through that. So I think that's amazing advice. I think that's beyond advice. I think that's amazing, an amazing remedy that people should seriously go back, listen again, like go back 30, 40 seconds in this podcast, listen to it again. I think that's super important.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Vanessa, for joining us here today. I understand your book is out on October 29th, 2024. Where is the best place for our listeners to pick up a copy?
Sure. You can go to hachetteBookGroup.com. It's also available on Amazon, Walmart, Target, all of the places.
And you have a website, is tellatherapist.net, correct?
Yes. TELLA therapist.net.
All right, we're back for final thoughts after the interview with Vanessa Reiser. What an incredible interview. This book is excellent and so helpful for so many people.
Yeah, it really goes beyond just the relationship topic when it comes to narcissistic relationships. Beyond husband and wife, it goes into the power dynamic of CEOs and people in power and how they use their power. And I have been saying since the beginning of time, when we were first getting into this, and as we learned and spoke with people who are in these relationships, one thing that really stood out was, in my eyes, so telling how subtle it all happens. And every time we talk to somebody, I'm always saying, like, how did you notice? When did you notice? It was so subtle. And there's that old saying that Vanessa brought up, which is death by 1,000 cuts. And I had never applied that to this. And when she said it, it just like gave me the chills, because that's exactly what it is. You don't realize how bad it is until you're on like the 900th cut. And then it's the incredibly impossible, or the seemingly impossible task of getting out of it.
Absolutely. And it's stuff you wouldn't expect. Like when she mentioned how people will email themselves from someone else's email account. That was absolutely mind blowing to me. I just never considered that. And I think that's probably a big part of the problem is that people who are in relationships with narcissists would never imagine what the other person would do. And she used another great example about, I think it was a jar of pickles or something outside of a courtroom for no reason other
Right.
than confusion.
No reason.
So
yeah.
it's just hard to relate because, if there's a clear motive, it just clicks a little bit better. But this is so insidious that it's hidden in just ways you can't even understand.
Yeah, that jar of pickle thing was such a great example because if ever confronted over something so innocuous as that, a person who does that will just simply say, why are you making a big deal about it? It's a joke. It's a stupid joke. But it's just this like mind manipulation. They know it, and the other person knows it, but the people around them don't know it. And that's what is really effective for the narcissist. Another chilling moment was when she said that after you asked her, what happens if the person actually commits suicide, like takes their own life because of this, and she gave a chef's kiss. She was like, "That's the best thing that could happen. That's the creme de la creme of what they want to have happen." And they're not ultimately like, pulling the trigger or forcing the prescription medication down someone's throat. They can take a step back and wipe their hands clean of it.
Yeah, no, and I'm sure they would enjoy the attention it brought afterwards because people would say, "I'm sorry for your loss," and things like that, So, yeah, it's truly terrifying. I also just wanted to note the cover of her book with the peacock feathers was interesting when she said that they're beautiful but violent, and really says a lot about the kind of people that she's writing about here.
Yeah, but she does give some hope. I mean, this isn't if you haven't read the book, it's not a totally bleak situation. You can get out of it. She gives some examples on how to get out of it. And one thing that we had never heard before that she had brought to the table was how the brain is injured by this. And it just totally makes sense. If you eat a certain food and you've always had a beer with that food, every time you eat a hamburger, your brain and your body, you want a beer. It's just you've created a habit for your brain and you've left that impression. And it's the same thing with abuse. It's the same thing when you're being gaslit. Your brain is starting to adapt to that way of processing information. So you're getting damaged, you're getting injured, but you can repair it. And I'll bring up our Crawlspace episode with J.W. Oker, which in a weird way, the timing worked out. And in a weird way, he's a horror writer. He writes horror stories for kids. He writes true life horror stories. But it has this surreal parallel to this conversation. A lot of things that he said, Vanessa said as well, in a different, more clinical way. But we brought up to him how we had just spoken to Vanessa, and she said, play some music that, in order to get out of this, play some music that the person was a fan of before they were in the situation. Cook them a meal that maybe their mom cooked them before they were in the situation that can bring back these old feelings. And he laughed and shook his head in sort of this exasperated way because we were talking about cults and how to get somebody out of a cult. And he said, it just goes to show you how challenging it is when you have to ratatouille somebody out of this situation. So he makes a lighthearted comment in an exasperated way. And it's just like that parallel to me just struck where it's so important to do that. And you wouldn't think about it. Like these are the things you have to think about now because you're trying so desperately to get this person out of the situation. But it is those things that can help heal the brain is what she's saying. That keep doing those things to bring them back to the person they were before they went into the situation, before they got damaged.
Yeah, tap into their sense memory of who they were before. And that was pretty wild. Definitely never thought of anything like that. So yeah, I really hope everyone listening would get the help that they need if they do need help. And you can go to her website, teletherapist.net, and you can even get a free consultation with her. But she is an expert on this, and it's such a sort of niche part of domestic violence, I guess.
All right, we appreciate you all sticking around through the entire conversation to listen to these final thoughts. We're going to try to do this more because I think you and I, Tim, both realize after we've experienced the conversation, then listen to the episode after a little bit of a delay, listen to it later on, you and I just have these thoughts and these conversations. So
yeah,
it's just a way to try to like answer the thoughts that we know the listeners have and be on that same, I don't know, educational learning level that, you know, we're all kind of learning about everything. So yeah, hopefully this is something that people enjoy.
Cool. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody.